A lot of weird shit came out of the 70s. In this case, we're looking at Ralph Bakshi's 1977 animated film Wizards. Set 10 million years after a nuclear war, it's a tale of the battle between magic and technology, rationalism versus mysticism. It's also a prime example of the mythologizing of World War II, both in terms of the post-war generation's myth-making and in contrast to how the mythology has been reworked and repurposed today. Quick setup. There are fertile green goodlands full of flowers and bunnies where the elves and fairies live idyllic lives. The Badlands are a dreary, radiation-scarred, mortar-esque wasteland full of mutants and misery. The lands are ruled by two brothers, wizards. The good one, Avatar, is a delightfully crotchety, whiskey-drinking, cigar-smoking garden gnome. The bad brother, Black Wolf, is a bony-armed Saruman type who grew up torturing animals and is generally an unpleasant fellow. When their mother died, Black Wolf tried to seize power in the Goodlands, but his brother fought him. Even though Black Wolf was the more powerful wizard, Avatar won the fight because he was filled with emotion over their mother's death burning inside, and that fueled his will to fight. This feels like setup for something. For the next 3,000 years, Black Wolf's mutant horde tries to invade the Goodlands, only to retreat in disarray. Goblins just aren't motivated. They lack discipline. They don't believe in any higher cause. But Black Wolf has been scouring the ruins looking for some lost technology to give him an edge. He learns how to make machine guns, tanks, and aircraft, and he rediscovers the art of propaganda to motivate his soldiers and demoralize the enemy. Behold! If this sounds like an unholy mishmash of a children's fantasy cartoon and pulp military sci-fi, well, it kind of is. It uses a lot of shorthand to convey its ideas, relying heavily on Nazi imagery. This is nothing new in fantasy. We've seen it before with things like the masked Uruk-hai while Saruman watches from his balcony in The Lord of the Rings. The themes of quasi-industrial orcs attacking agrarian villages is a staple of the genre, but Wizards goes all in with the Nazi comparison. And this is where I find it particularly interesting. Not so much as a blunt allegorical World War II story, but as a blunt allegory made in a prior generation that had somewhat different assumptions about the war. Now, to really get this, we have to look back at the Allied propaganda during World War II, much of which was built on the same themes from the Great War, depicting the Germans as brutal subhuman Huns. Wizards continues with this in a direct line, slapping swastikas on mutant orc monsters out to spread darkness over the earth. Point being that Nazis were not subtle, and neither was the propaganda directed against them. In previous videos, I've talked a little bit about a Nazi echo, the idea that the war had such an impact that it reverberates through the culture across generations. It has its own archetypes, things that even people with no historical understanding get on a basic conceptual level. Wizards is part of the first echo. Its writer and director Ralph Bakshi was born in 1938, so he was a child during the war, and afterwards he was on the front edge of that post-war generation, surrounded by the fresh mythology of Nazis as a singular evil. And like many others of that generation that grew up to make movies and television shows in the 70s, his worldview was heavily influenced by it. But it's a different Nazi mythology than we have today. Wizards freely throws swastikas up on the screen and mixes Hitler speeches into the soundtrack. It's just part of the symbolism, stewing bad things together, goblins and radiation and Nazis in a cartoon. No one misinterpreted any of it as somehow pro-Nazi. No one would claim that merely seeing a wizard sweep aside swastika curtains caused them harm. It was just cultural shorthand that everyone understood. It's also another example that illustrates the linguistic shift around the word Holocaust.
Bits and pieces of pre-Holocaust technology were being dug up and marched back to Scorch 1.
Prior to the 80s, it wasn't capital H Holocaust as people use it today, but was often applied to nuclear war and the fiction of the time. This shaping of language is one of many ways that history is not simply a collection of facts about the past, but rather a constantly shifting story that responds to the present day, shaped by social perception, politics, and of course pop culture. Wizards is a rather garish example of that first echo back at us. The first generation growing up in the aftermath of the war. Today, we're several generations removed and several echoes into it, each one losing fidelity until we can't really make out the words, only the tone. The mythology now echoes itself so much that it no longer has much to do with the reality that sparked it. Nazi imagery has transformed from documented reality during the war to symbolic shorthand of evil, and now it's essentially become almost a magical talisman, an invocation of racism, unacceptable in any context, lest some fragile soul suffer emotional trauma from the mere sight of it. Today, people regularly accuse their political opponents of having secret Nazi sympathies. Gone is the bloodthirsty, brutish Hun, replaced by a cunning wolf in sheep's clothing waiting to go all secret Hitler when the moment is right. Wizards uses the Nazi mythology as a blunt shorthand throughout to convey its ideas. It's giving us a basic allegorical representation of the Second World War, almost as though it was a tale passed on from thousands of years ago, losing the details, getting embellished, but retaining the broad strokes. It sets itself up this way from the beginning with the backstory given in this great book. I also find it interesting that the book is made to look handwritten by scribes, but it uses that routing number font that was common into the early 80s to convey a sense of high-tech coolness. It gives the whole thing a Canicle for Leibowitz feel that I appreciate. The book tells us that the war begins, as they usually do, with a legitimate grievance. The mutants are confined to the Badlands, and they want to live in the Goodlands. They need better Lebensraum. But they lack a motivating idea. Black Wolf, using propaganda, directs the populace in a singular purpose: war on the elves. It's crude, there's no sense of blood and soil kinship, no appeal to a greater mutant state, but it serves its purpose of establishing propaganda as a magical means of bending the masses to a dictator's will. The elves are arrogant and overconfident.
Them goblins and demons just look mean, but they yella. They got no cause to fight. They always give up and run with our arrows chasing them all the way home.
Until they're overrun by a well-organized mechanized army. We get a condensed thematic version of the war. Mutant soldiers aren't just automatons. Some of them don't want to fight.
I don't want to fight anymore.
You gotta.
I don't want to hurt things anymore.
Hey, you're so stupid.
Listen, Orc, I ain't stupid. Just listen. You know what I mean? Trees, birds, butterflies, everything's got a right to live.
Others are motivated by personal hatred of the enemy more than ideological reasons.
They've killed Fritz! They've killed Fritz! Those lousy, stinking yellow fairies! Those horrible atrocity-filled vermin!
And some are just weak-willed functionaries following orders, even when those orders are appalling.
You see, Black Wolf, you know, our Fuhrer...
Wasn't our fault.
Shut up, will you? Black Wolf, our Fuhrer started this war, see? We got all these prisoners, we don't want to feed them or stuff like that.
We got time for that, we just got time for war.
Yeah. Okay, Charlie, it's no good. Put Plan A to work. It's about time.
It becomes more hero-centric toward the end, as epic adaptations of historical events are wont to do. But still, there are some simplistic parallels. To defeat Black Wolf, the alliance of elves, fairies, and an old wizard have to attack the heart of the mutant kingdom, have to take their city. This is the point where the wizard's name, Avatar, actually makes some sense, because he is a stand-in for the allies in that moment, delivering the killing blow, with a Luger no less. Wizards also follows the fantasy trope of equating industrialization with destruction, dehumanization, and more subtly the expansion of evil forces. The mutants have factories churning out tanks and black smoke. They live in a dense city with all the ills of urban society. Even the artistic style of the city and factories lays into this idea of industry as a destructive force. The visuals, with their hard lines and gray palette, bear a passing resemblance to the Diego Rivera Court in the Detroit Institute of Arts, a series of murals painted by a communist, working on commission, that depict capitalist industry as a mechanism of environmental exploitation, oppression, and soul-crushing mechanization. But we'll talk more about industrialization and fantasy in a future video. Wizards is a cultural artifact that captures the perception of Nazi Germany on the spiritual level rather than the rational or the historical, because it was dehumanizing and reliant on propaganda to bend the will of the masses. It had a very real historical occult element, runic symbols and torchlit rituals. They had their own holy relics and holy sites. And this dark mysticism was coupled with exceptional technical skill. There's a reason that the Nazis are an enduring template for fantasy and science fiction villains. They had all the elements that strike those deep cores, threatening and somehow appealing at the same time. More broadly, Wizards captures some essence of modern war. The mix of lies and machinery that churn up men fighting for people that don't give a shit about them. It's garish and crude, almost comical in its brutality. The president of the Goodlands is a literal clown before being assassinated by evil Elmo. Wizards portrays the absurdity of nations at war in a way that only something as ridiculous as a cartoon about elves fighting a Nazi sorcerer can. This one pairs well with the White Russian, or 2 or 3.